Fire had always meant safety on the frontier, until the day it didn't. In a single morning, a trusted cabin becomes a trap, and years of survival knowledge are put on trial. With no help coming and no time to hesitate, one settler must choose between what he built and staying alive. What follows reveals how thin the line really was between survival and loss. The cabin sat deep in the American wilderness, far beyond established towns and wagon routes. Snow pressed against the log walls, packed hard by weeks of wind. The forest surrounding the clearing stood still, heavy with winter's silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the hearth inside. This isolation was not an accident. It was chosen. Distance meant freedom, resources, and land uncontested. But it also meant that when trouble came, there would be no help riding over the ridge. Samuel Harkins had built his life around that understanding. He was not a reckless man, nor an inexperienced one. Years on the frontier had shaped his habits into routines that rarely failed him. Every morning followed the same pattern: assess the weather, tend the fire, check supplies, then plan the day's labor. Survival, he believed, was the product of discipline rather than luck. That belief had kept him alive where others had vanished quietly into the landscape. Fire was central to that discipline. It was not a comfort or a convenience. It was a system. The hearth had been placed with intention, stones set carefully, airflow considered, wood selected and stacked days in advance. Samuel understood that fire could preserve life just as easily as it could end it. That understanding had never been casual. It was practiced daily, reinforced with small habits: clearing ash, watching embers, listening to the sound of burning logs. That morning began no differently. Outside, the temperature hovered well below freezing, the kind of cold that stiffened joints and punished bare skin in seconds. Inside the cabin, warmth pooled low to the ground, held in place by thick logs and packed clay. Samuel moved through the space calmly, aware of each creak in the floor and every familiar shadow cast by the firelight. There was no sense of danger yet, only routine. The first sign came quietly. The heat felt sharper than usual, less even. It pressed higher into the room instead of settling where it belonged. Samuel noticed it in the way his breath felt heavier, warmer than expected. He paused, standing still, letting experience speak before instinct rushed in. Fire always gave warnings. The problem was that those warnings were easy to dismiss. Smoke followed next, thin and almost polite. It did not billow or choke. It drifted, hugging the ceiling, blurring the clean lines of the rafters. Smoke inside a cabin was not uncommon. A shift in wind could cause it. A fresh log could release it. Samuel adjusted his position, watched the hearth, and listened. The fire answered with a low, steady roar, deeper than it should have been. He moved closer, careful but not alarmed. The stones of the hearth radiated intense heat, more than the size of the fire justified. His eyes traced the path of smoke, noticing how it no longer flowed cleanly towards the chimney. Something in the system had changed. A draft reversed, a blockage formed. These were small failures, but on the frontier, small failures rarely stayed small. Outside, the wind shifted again, pressing against the cabin's walls. Snow rattled faintly against the logs. The structure responded with a muted groan, a reminder that it was a living thing built of wood and force rather than permanence. Samuel adjusted the fire, stepping back to reassess. For a brief moment, it seemed to respond. The smoke thinned, the heat eased. Then the sound changed. It was subtle at first, a sharper crack beneath the fire's usual rhythm. Wood settling, perhaps, or something worse. Samuel turned toward the far wall, where the logs met near the hearth. The air there shimmered unnaturally. Heat distorted the space, making the wall appear to breathe. His calm narrowed into focus. This was not normal behavior. He crossed the cabin quickly, running a hand near the logs without touching them. The heat there was wrong, too intense, too localized. Fire had found a hidden path.
Whether through a gap in chinking or a flaw in the stonework no longer mattered. What mattered was that the fire was no longer contained by design. It was testing the structure itself. In that moment, routine fractured. Years of preparation collided with the raw reality of the frontier. Fire was no longer an ally working within limits. It was becoming a force with its own intention. Samuel understood the implication immediately. A cabin fire was not a house fire in the modern sense. There were no tools nearby meant to stop it, no external water source, no neighbors shouting warnings. The isolation he had chosen now pressed inward. There was no margin for error left. Every second spent assessing was a second the fire used to advance. Smoke thickened, lowering toward eye level, stealing clarity from the room. The warmth that once meant safety now burned the skin, aggressive and urgent. Samuel forced himself to slow down rather than panic. Panic was how settlers died. He scanned the cabin one last time, not with sentiment, but calculation. Supplies, exits, wind direction. The fire cracked again, louder this time, and a dull glow began to show through the logs near the hearth. That glow erased any remaining doubt. Fire had escaped its boundaries. The cabin, the product of years of labor and careful planning, was becoming fuel. The structure that had protected him from winter was now aligning with it, ready to turn warmth into destruction. Samuel stepped back as heat surged outward, swallowing the space he had occupied moments before. The frontier offered no second chances for denial. He understood that now with absolute clarity. The fire was spreading beyond control, and the cabin itself had begun to burn. Frontier cabins were built to resist cold, hunger, and time, but fire tested them differently. Their strength lay not in comfort but in endurance, shaped by necessity and limited choices. What protected settlers from winter often carried a hidden cost that only revealed itself under pressure. Long before the fire broke free of its hearth, the cabin had already made its bargain with the frontier. These structures were not engineered by trained architects or supported by distant supply chains. They were raised by settlers who worked with what the land offered and what their bodies could manage. Logs were cut close to where they would stand, trimmed by hand, and stacked with an understanding that perfection was impossible. Speed mattered. Shelter mattered more. Logs formed the backbone of nearly every frontier cabin. Thick timber provided insulation against brutal cold, slowing the loss of heat during nights that could stretch endlessly. Gaps between logs were packed with clay, mud, moss, or ash, materials chosen because they were available, not because they were ideal. Stone, when found nearby, was reserved for the hearth, the single most important feature of the cabin. Without it, winter survival was unlikely. Every material choice reflected a calculated risk. Logs burned, but they also held warmth longer than thin walls. Clay sealed drafts, but cracked with repeated heating and cooling. Stone contained fire, but conducted heat relentlessly. Settlers understood these trade-offs in practical terms, not theoretical ones. A cabin was never meant to last generations. It was meant to last long enough. The hearth itself represented the heart of that compromise. Positioned carefully, it provided heat for cooking, warmth for sleeping, and a place to dry clothing soaked by snow or labor. Its design relied on balance, enough airflow to draw smoke upward, enough mass to hold heat without transferring it outward too aggressively. When that balance held, life inside the cabin stabilized around it. Heat retention was the cabin's greatest advantage and its quiet threat. Thick log walls trapped heat efficiently, allowing a small fire to maintain livable conditions even in deep winter. But excess heat had nowhere to go. Over time, repeated heating dried nearby wood, hardened clay, and expanded small imperfections. These changes were gradual, invisible to anyone not looking for them. Settlers accepted this risk because the alternative was worse. A poorly sealed cabin meant freezing nights, wasted fuel, and physical decline. A fire that burned hot but efficiently was safer than one constantly starved for oxygen. Comfort was never the goal. Survival was. That distinction shaped every decision made during construction.
Samuel Harkins had known these principles when he built his cabin. He had chosen the straightest logs available, packed them tightly, and positioned the hearth where it would distribute heat evenly. The stonework had been done carefully, but stone itself carried its own dangers. It absorbed heat steadily and released it slowly, warming the surrounding structure even after flames died down. This was useful until it wasn't. One overlooked weakness haunted many frontier cabins: the gradual failure of boundaries. Clay dried and shrank, stones shifted under thermal stress, gaps formed where none had existed before. These flaws were rarely dramatic. They did not announce themselves. They waited, growing slowly, fed by repetition and routine. Fire safety on the frontier was not about comfort features or safeguards. It was about awareness. Settlers relied on observation, habit, and respect for fire's behavior. They watched smoke patterns, listened to changes in sound, and adjusted routines as seasons shifted. There were no alarms to warn of danger, only experience and attention. That morning, the cabin's design had worked exactly as intended until it didn't. The same walls that held warmth now reflected heat inward. The same stone hearth that stabilized the fire now radiated intensity beyond its limits. Fire had found a path through a weakness no one could see from the outside. The cabin did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was built for endurance, not containment. It was designed to hold fire close, not to restrain it when conditions shifted. The frontier demanded closeness to fire, a daily negotiation that favored warmth over distance. As flames spread within the structure, the logic of the cabin turned against its purpose. Logs dried by years of heat ignited more readily. Clay cracked under stress, opening seams that allowed heat to travel. Airflow reversed, feeding the fire rather than removing its byproducts. Each strength compounded the problem. Samuel understood this as the situation unfolded. The cabin was behaving exactly as frontier cabins had always behaved under such conditions. There was no flaw to fix, no adjustment to make that would restore balance. The design had reached its limit. This was the quiet truth settlers lived with, but rarely confronted until it was too late. Fire was essential, but it was never truly controlled. Cabins endured cold by embracing fire, and in doing so, they accepted the possibility of sudden loss. Knowledge reduced risk, but it never erased it. Outside, winter pressed closer, indifferent to human systems and calculations. Inside, the fire continued to grow, using the cabin's own strength as fuel. The structure that had resisted storms and seasons now offered itself to the flames, board by board, seam by seam. The cabin's greatest strength, its ability to hold heat, was now feeding the fire. Fire rewards discipline and punishes complacency without warning. On the frontier, it was never neutral. It served those who respected its limits and destroyed those who assumed it would behave the same way every day. The difference between warmth and catastrophe was often measured in moments too small to notice until they were gone. Inside an enclosed wooden space, fire behaved differently than it did outdoors. Flames that seemed calm in open air could grow unpredictable once surrounded by walls that trapped heat and redirected airflow. In a cabin, fire did not simply burn upward, it searched. It followed oxygen, pressure changes, and hidden gaps.
The structure itself shaped its movement, sometimes in ways that even experienced settlers could not fully anticipate. Airflow was the first invisible force at work. Chimneys were meant to draw smoke and heat upward, creating a steady draft that kept flames contained. But that system depended on balance. Wind direction, outside temperature, and even the height of surrounding trees could disrupt it. When airflow reversed or stalled, smoke lingered, heat accumulated, and fire behavior shifted from stable to aggressive. These changes often happened quietly, without the dramatic signs people expected.
Sparks posed a different danger. Small embers escaped fires constantly, carried upward by heat currents. Most died harmlessly against stone or fell back into ash. Others found dry wood, cracks in clay, or crevices near beams that had been warming for years. A single spark was rarely the problem. Repetition was. Over time, exposure turned sturdy logs into kindling waiting for the right conditions. Creosote buildup added another layer of risk. Soot and residue collected inside chimneys, especially when fires burned low and slow to conserve fuel. Settlers knew this residue was flammable, but removing it completely was difficult and dangerous work. Many cabins lived with partial buildup, accepting it as another calculated risk. When ignited, creosote burned hot and fast, transferring intense heat into surrounding materials. Heat buildup itself was often underestimated. Stone hearths absorbed enormous amounts of energy during long burns. That heat did not disappear when flames subsided. It radiated outward for hours, sometimes seeping into nearby wood. Over months and years, this constant exposure dried logs from the inside out. Dry wood burned faster, ignited easier, and failed more suddenly. To manage these risks, settlers relied on strict routines. Fires were tended daily, ash cleared regularly, and logs selected with care. Wood was dried but not over-dried. Fires were built small but steady, avoiding sudden surges of heat. Smoke patterns were watched closely, especially during wind changes. These routines were not optional. They were survival habits passed between families and neighbors through hard-earned experience. Samuel Harkins followed these practices carefully. He understood fire as a system that required constant attention. He never left it unattended for long periods. He adjusted burns based on weather. He respected how quickly conditions could change. His survival to this point was proof that discipline mattered. What he understood correctly was fire's need for balance. He knew that starving a fire created smoke, while feeding it too aggressively created excess heat. He recognized that fire had moods shaped by environment rather than intention. That knowledge had guided him through countless winters without incident.
The rule he underestimated was subtle but unforgiving. Fire never forgets past conditions. Each burn altered the environment it occupied. Each day of safe fire use changed the cabin incrementally, drying wood, stressing joints, widening unseen gaps. The danger did not reset when flames died down, it accumulated quietly. On that morning, the accumulated effects aligned. Airflow shifted under changing wind. Heat stored in stone intensified beyond normal limits. Dried wood responded faster than expected. Fire did not suddenly become dangerous, it simply took advantage of conditions that had been building for years. Once control began to slip, fire moved faster than human response. Heat increased first, overwhelming senses and narrowing focus. Smoke followed, descending steadily as oxygen levels dropped near the ceiling. Vision blurred, judgment slowed, and time compressed into instinctive reactions. What had been a manageable system minutes earlier became an advancing force. Fire overtook control not through explosion or sudden collapse, but through acceleration. Each second fed the next. Attempts to correct airflow or reduce fuel no longer produced immediate results. The system no longer responded to adjustment. It had crossed a threshold where reaction lagged behind consequence. Samuel felt this shift as a physical presence. The air pressed inward, heavy and oppressive. His movements required more effort. Familiar routines no longer applied cleanly. Fire was no longer waiting for instruction, it was asserting itself, filling space, claiming material. This was the frontier's greatest lesson about fire. It allowed little room for recovery once discipline broke down. Mistakes were not always obvious, and correction windows were short. Fire did not negotiate, it responded only to physics, indifferent to experience or intention. As heat intensified, smoke lowered steadily toward the floor. The cabin's interior shrank into a narrowing zone of survivable air. Objects once harmless became obstacles. Pathways closed without warning. Each breath carried urgency. Samuel recognized that control had already been lost. What remained was adaptation under pressure. The ally he had relied on for survival had turned into a force he could no longer manage. The fire was no longer confined to its role. It was rewriting it. Heat continued to build, smoke thickened, escape options began to vanish. Plans collapse faster than structures. What remains is judgment under pressure. On the frontier, this moment arrived without warning and without sympathy, forcing decisions that could not be revised once made. Inside the cabin, order dissolved rapidly. What had once been a controlled environment built around routine and familiarity became unstable within minutes. Tools that were always within reach blurred into indistinct shapes through smoke. Corners of the room that once offered certainty now held heat and confusion. The structure no longer supported decision-making, it actively resisted it. Smoke altered perception before panic had a chance to form. It lowered unevenly, creating layers of visibility that shifted with every breath. Samuel felt his awareness narrow, not from fear, but from the body's instinctive response to compromised air. His eyes burned slightly, his thoughts slowed just enough to become noticeable. This was the danger settlers rarely described in detail, the quiet erosion of clarity. Balance followed next. Heat pooled at unexpected angles, warming the floor unevenly and softening the packed earth beneath his boots. Movements that required no thought moments earlier now demanded care. Each step had to be placed deliberately. The cabin, once predictable, had become unfamiliar territory. This was where structured decision-making began to fail. Frontier preparation relied on sequence: identify, adjust, correct. Fire disrupted sequence by compressing time. There was no longer room to work through options methodically. The mind shifted toward prioritization, discarding anything that did not serve immediate survival. Survival priorities reordered themselves instantly. Protecting the structure fell away. Saving supplies became secondary. What remained were fundamentals: air, mobility, orientation. These priorities were not chosen consciously. They asserted themselves, overriding everything else Samuel had learned to value. This transition separated survivors from casualties more than strength or bravery ever did. Frontier history showed that hesitation killed more settlers than fire itself, not because hesitation was cowardice, but because it extended exposure. Each second spent reconsidering was a second surrendered to worsening conditions. Samuel felt that pull toward hesitation as a physical weight. The cabin represented safety earned through labor. Leaving it meant accepting uncertainty. Staying meant confronting a threat that grew more aggressive by the moment. The mind searched for a solution that preserved both, even when none existed. Smoke thickened again, dropping lower, pressing closer to the floor. Breathing required adjustment, slower and more deliberate. The air tasted different now, heavy with ash and heat. Samuel recognized this stage immediately. Experience told him that clarity would degrade rapidly from here. Instinct began to surface, not as panic, but as narrowing focus. Peripheral details faded, sound flattened, attention centered on exits, spacing, and movement. This was not the instinct of desperation, but the instinct shaped by years of survival thinking. The body moved before the mind finished explaining why.
Tools lost relevance. Even objects meant to help could slow escape if handled poorly. Samuel resisted the impulse to gather more than he could manage. Frontier survivors learned that overloaded hands reduced mobility and increased risk. Survival favored readiness, not accumulation. The psychological weight of abandoning shelter pressed hardest here. A cabin was more than wood and stone. It represented permanence in a landscape that offered none. Leaving it behind felt like stepping backward in progress, undoing years of effort in minutes. That emotional resistance delayed many settlers fatally. Samuel acknowledged the weight without indulging it. The frontier punished emotional negotiation. Acceptance had to come before resolution. Loss could be addressed later, if later existed. Right now, judgment mattered more than meaning. Heat surged again, forcing retreat from the interior. The fire no longer behaved like a contained system. It asserted itself through sound and movement, cracking and shifting as materials failed. Samuel understood that the window for controlled action had closed. This was no longer about fixing a problem. It was about escaping one. He moved toward the doorway with purpose, not haste. Haste led to mistakes. Purpose preserved coordination. Smoke thickened behind him, and visibility shrank to a narrow tunnel toward open air. The cold outside pressed inward sharply, a stark contrast that confirmed the choice even as it complicated it. This was the final internal negotiation. Stay inside, where warmth remained, but air disappeared, or step into cold, where breath returned, but shelter vanished. Frontier survival demanded acceptance of trade-offs rather than solutions. Samuel made that choice without dramatics. As he crossed the threshold, heat chased him outward, urging speed. Fire had claimed the interior fully now. The structure he had known was already changing shape, already becoming something else. What remained was movement and consequence. The moment of departure carried no relief. It carried transition. Preparation had carried Samuel to this point. Instinct carried him through it. Neither alone would have been sufficient. Behind him, the cabin continued to surrender to fire. Ahead lay cold, exposure, and uncertainty. The frontier offered no pause between dangers, only a change in them. Samuel did not look back immediately. Looking back invited hesitation, and hesitation had already claimed enough lives. He focused instead on distance, air, and footing. Survival had been chosen, but it did not come without cost. The consequences of that choice had not yet surfaced, but they were already forming, waiting beyond the heat and smoke to reveal themselves. On the frontier, survival often demanded surrender. Not surrender to fear or defeat, but surrender to reality as it unfolded, indifferent to effort or intention. Cabins were built to protect life, yet settlers understood a hard truth: no shelter was worth dying inside. Loss of a cabin was not rare in frontier history. Fires, floods, storms, and structural failures erased years of labor in a single night. Settlers spoke of such losses plainly because they had to. Emotion lingered only as long as it could be afforded. Survival required movement, not mourning. A burned cabin was a setback, not an ending, provided the person walked away alive. Rebuilding was expected because rebuilding was possible. Timber could be cut again, clay could be packed again, stone could be stacked again. What could not be replaced was time lost to injury or exposure. Frontier culture quietly prioritized the body over the structure. A settler who lived could recover. One who hesitated too long inside a burning cabin could not. This understanding shaped how settlers approached crisis. Emotional discipline was as critical as physical skill. Panic consumed energy. Attachment delayed action. Those who survived learned to sever emotional ties quickly when conditions demanded it. The cabin was important, but it was not sacred. Life came first. Samuel reached that threshold as heat surged behind him. The interior space that defined his daily existence became hostile, each second narrowing his margin. He stood near the doorway, feeling the cold air press against his face from outside, while heat chased him from within. The contrast was immediate and shocking. Warmth meant safety moments earlier.
Now it meant danger. Stepping outside without shelter in winter carried its own risks. Cold could kill slowly and quietly. Exposure punished indecision just as fire did. Samuel knew this balance well. The frontier demanded constant evaluation of competing dangers, choosing the one that allowed the greatest chance of survival. Staying inside meant surrendering to fire. Leaving meant confronting the cold directly. Firelight spilled through the doorway, casting long, unstable shadows across the snow. The cabin glowed unnaturally, no longer a place of refuge, but a source of threat, visible even from a distance. That light guided Samuel's movement, even as it warned him to keep his distance. Fire served both roles simultaneously, illuminating the path while marking the boundary he could no longer cross.
As he stepped fully outside, the cold struck with force. Air burned the lungs. Snow reflected the fire's glow, making the clearing appear larger and more exposed than before. The cabin behind him cracked and shifted as internal supports weakened. The sound was not dramatic, but it carried finality. What had been stable was now changing shape permanently. Leaving the cabin meant leaving tools, supplies, and the accumulated order of years. It meant accepting uncertainty without immediate replacement. Yet that acceptance was itself a survival act. Frontier history was filled with examples of settlers who survived precisely because they walked away early enough. Those who stayed too long often disappeared from record altogether. The transition from structure to exposure happened in seconds, but its implications stretched far longer. Inside the cabin, systems existed: walls, fire, routines. Outside, only environment remained. Wind, temperature, terrain, and time dictated outcomes. Survival shifted from maintenance to improvisation. Samuel did not look back for long. Looking back invited hesitation, and hesitation had no place here. He focused instead on distance, on creating space between himself and the advancing heat. Fire could travel faster than expected when fed by structure. The open clearing offered fewer paths for it to follow. Standing in the cold, Samuel felt the absence of shelter immediately. Heat drained from his body as quickly as it had once accumulated inside the cabin. Clothing that had been adequate moments before now felt insufficient. The frontier made no allowances for recent effort. It responded only to present conditions. This moment marked a psychological turning point. The cabin had represented stability, routine, and a sense of control over environment. Its loss forced a recalibration of identity. Samuel was no longer a man inside a home managing risk. He was a man in open wilderness managing survival minute by minute. Firelight continued to guide him as he moved farther from the structure. It revealed the edges of the clearing, the line where trees began, and the uneven ground beneath the snow. At the same time, it signaled danger. Wind shifted sparks unpredictably. Heat radiated outward in pulses. Distance mattered now. Frontier settlers often spoke of this transition without drama. Leaving shelter was described as a necessary step, not a tragic one. Emotion was acknowledged later, if at all. In the moment, clarity mattered more than feeling. Samuel embodied that restraint now, his focus narrowing to breath, footing, and positioning. Behind him, the cabin's outline softened as smoke thickened. The structure that had defined his daily existence became just another element of the landscape, altered and unstable. Ahead lay open wilderness, unmarked and indifferent, offering no guarantees, but still offering possibility. The frontier did not reward attachment, it rewarded adaptation. Samuel's choice to abandon shelter aligned him with that principle, even as it exposed him to new risks. Survival had been chosen, but it demanded payment in uncertainty. Beyond the burning cabin lay open wilderness in the unknown, waiting to judge the decision he had just made. Fire rarely finished the job. Cold often did. On the frontier, escaping flames was only the first test. What followed was quieter, slower, and far less forgiving. The moment Samuel put distance between himself and the cabin, the cold began its work. Heat drained from his body at a pace that felt unnatural, as if the warmth he had carried moments earlier had been borrowed rather than owned.
His breath turned sharp and shallow, each inhale biting deeper than the last. The transition from fire to winter was not gradual, it was immediate and absolute. Hypothermia did not arrive as panic, it arrived as confusion. The body responded first, tightening muscles, stiffening fingers, pulling blood inward to protect vital organs. Clothing that had seemed sufficient inside the cabin now offered only limited resistance. The outer layers trapped some warmth, but the air between them cooled quickly. Any moisture from sweat began to work against him, accelerating heat loss rather than preventing it. Dryness mattered more now than it had minutes earlier. Fire had not burned his clothing, but heat and exertion had compromised it. Wool that once insulated effectively now held dampness. Leather stiffened as temperatures dropped. Insulation failed unevenly, leaving some areas numb while others burned with cold. These were subtle changes, but on the frontier, subtle shifts often determined outcomes.
Wind joined the cold without ceremony. It moved through the clearing with purpose, stripping warmth from exposed skin and finding gaps in clothing with practiced ease. Trees offered little protection here. Their bare branches broke the wind inconsistently, creating unpredictable currents that pushed against Samuel from changing directions. Standing still invited loss. Movement became necessary, but movement consumed energy. Terrain added another layer of pressure. Snow concealed uneven ground, forcing careful steps that slowed progress. Each misstep risked a fall, and a fall risked prolonged contact with the ground. Cold transferred faster through snow-packed earth than through air. Settlers knew this well. Avoiding the ground was a principle learned early, reinforced through bitter experience. Frontier cold-weather survival relied on simple but uncompromising rules. Stay dry, block the wind, insulate from the ground, keep moving without exhausting strength. None of these principles worked in isolation. Each depended on the others, forming a system as delicate as the one Samuel had just lost to fire. He assessed his remaining limits without optimism or despair. Fatigue crept in faster than expected, not from exertion, but from cold itself. Muscles demanded more effort to perform basic tasks. Hands lost precision. Fine motor control began to fade, replaced by slower, heavier movement. This was the danger zone, where mistakes multiplied quietly. Time became the true enemy, not the dramatic passage of hours, but the steady erosion of capability minute by minute. Cold did not need to overwhelm all at once. It only needed to reduce effectiveness enough to prevent corrective action. Frontier accounts often described men who felt capable right until they were not. That transition could be sudden. Samuel forced himself to remain deliberate. He resisted the urge to rush blindly into the trees, knowing that panic-driven movement often led to injury or exhaustion. He oriented himself instead, using the fire's glow behind him as a reference point. It marked where danger lay and where heat still existed, even if unreachable. It also marked time. As long as the fire burned visibly, daylight had not fully surrendered.
Cold sharpened awareness as it threatened clarity. Sounds carried farther. The crunch of snow underfoot seemed louder. Wind through branches took on structure and rhythm. These sensations competed with the dulling effect of numbness, creating a strange tension between alertness and fatigue. Frontier survival demanded respect for that balance. Push too hard and the body failed early. Move too little and heat vanished. Samuel adjusted his pace carefully, keeping blood flowing without draining reserves. His goal was no longer comfort or recovery, it was delay, stretching functionality long enough to find or create the next layer of protection. Darkness loomed as an unspoken threat. Daylight offered visibility and orientation. Night stripped both away, replacing them with colder temperatures and deeper uncertainty. On the frontier, many survived the fire, only to lose the race against nightfall. Without shelter secured, darkness magnified every risk. Samuel felt the weight of that countdown pressing inward. The sky held its pale winter light for now, but the angle was lowering. Shadows lengthened across the snow, stretching towards him. Each minute carried significance. Choices made now would determine whether he faced night with preparation or with nothing but exposure. He paused briefly, not to rest, but to recalibrate. He needed wind cover, ground insulation, and a plan that did not rely on the burning cabin behind him. Cold rewarded foresight and punished delay. There would be no second chance to reassess once darkness settled fully. The frontier did not dramatize exposure. It applied it patiently. Samuel understood that truth now with renewed clarity. Fire had forced him outside, but cold would decide how far he could go.
As the light continued to fade, one reality sharpened above all others. Darkness was approaching, and no shelter had yet been secured. When systems fail, survival depends on rebuilding from fragments. The frontier never rewarded perfection in crisis. It rewarded those who could see value in what remained and danger in what appeared helpful. Improvisation was not creativity for its own sake. It was disciplined adaptation under narrowing limits. Samuel put more distance between himself and the burning cabin, not out of fear alone, but calculation. Fire radiated outward unevenly, carried by wind and fed by structure. Staying too close risked sparks and sudden shifts in heat. Moving too far risked losing the last dependable source of light and warmth. He positioned himself where the fire could still be used indirectly without being allowed to dominate the space. Emergency fire management away from structures followed different rules than hearth fires. There would be no containment, no walls to reflect heat, no chimney to regulate airflow. Any flame created now had to be small, controlled, and temporary. The goal was not comfort, it was survival through balance. Enough heat to slow cold, not enough to invite another disaster. Before fire could be addressed, the ground had to be dealt with. Snow-covered earth drained warmth relentlessly. Samuel knew that direct contact with the ground could undo even the best fire in minutes. He searched for materials that could create separation: bark, broken branches, debris carried from the edges of the clearing. Each piece mattered. Insulation was cumulative, built layer by layer rather than achieved all at once. Wind protection followed next. The forest offered partial shelter, but not uniformly. Trees broke gusts unpredictably, creating pockets of calm and sudden exposure. Samuel chose a spot where terrain and vegetation worked together, reducing airflow without trapping smoke. Bushcraft on the frontier was less about ideal locations and more about workable ones. Perfect shelter rarely existed in crisis.
Burned materials presented both opportunity and risk. Charred wood from the cabin lay scattered near the clearing's edge, some pieces still warm, others brittle and unstable. Burned wood ignited more easily, but it also burned faster and hotter. Handling it required caution. Heat could linger internally, even when surfaces appeared safe. Many settlers were injured by assuming burned meant harmless. Samuel selected pieces carefully, avoiding those that cracked or hissed under pressure. He used them sparingly, understanding that their value lay in immediacy rather than longevity. Burned materials offered speed, not endurance. They could bridge a gap, not build a future. Frontier bushcraft under crisis conditions relied on restraint as much as action. Every movement consumed energy, every decision carried consequences that unfolded slowly and often without warning. Samuel resisted the urge to rush into full reconstruction. He prioritized stability over ambition, creating a minimal system that could be adjusted as conditions changed. The balance between risk and necessity sharpened with each passing minute. Fire reduced cold, but increased exposure to smoke and sparks. Movement preserved circulation, but increased sweat. Stillness conserved energy, but invited numbness. There were no perfect choices, only acceptable ones. Samuel tested his position repeatedly, adjusting posture and materials as conditions shifted. He paid attention to how heat moved across the ground, how wind redirected smoke, how his body responded.
Survival narrowed into a series of small corrections rather than grand solutions. This was the frontier's reality, rarely captured in stories, but deeply understood by those who lived it.
Recovery and collapse existed close here. A small improvement, a better windbreak, a drier layer beneath him could extend survival significantly. A small mistake, a shift in wind, a misjudged ember could undo everything. The margin was thin, and it demanded respect. As darkness deepened, the fire behind him changed character. It no longer roared, it settled into a lower, steadier burn as parts of the structure collapsed inward. The glow softened, spreading unevenly across the snow. This altered its usefulness. Light became more diffuse, heat less predictable. Fire transitioned from active threat to lingering presence. It was then that Samuel noticed what the fire had left behind. Amid the debris were embers that held heat without flame, concentrated and controllable if handled correctly. They were dangerous if ignored and invaluable if understood. Embers could sustain warmth without attracting attention or spreading unpredictably. Frontier survival often depended on such overlooked states, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Recognizing this required experience and restraint. Embers demanded careful handling, insulation, and separation from flammable material. They offered steady heat without the volatility of open flame. Used improperly, they could reignite disaster. Used correctly, they could buy time. Samuel adjusted his plan around this realization. He worked slowly, deliberately, respecting the thin line between use and misuse. The burned landscape was not empty, it was transformed. What had been structure was now resource. What had been danger was now potential. This was improvisation in its truest form, not invention but reconfiguration. Survival rebuilt itself from fragments, guided by discipline rather than desperation. The fire had not ended when the cabin burned, it had changed state, and in that change it had left behind something both useful and dangerous. Morning light exposes what fire concealed. In the pale gray hours after night releases its grip, the frontier reveals truth without ceremony. Darkness allows hope to linger. Daylight demands accounting.
The first light reached the clearing slowly, filtering through thin winter cloud and bare branches. Shadows shortened, then dissolved, and the burned outline of the cabin emerged in full. What had glowed ominously through the night now appeared smaller, quieter, and irrevocably altered. Smoke no longer rose with urgency. What remained was structure reduced to shape and debris reduced to fact. The cabin had not vanished entirely. Sections of wall still stood, blackened and warped, leaning at uncertain angles. The roof had collapsed inward, burying what once defined interior space beneath ash, charred beams, and broken stone. The hearth remained identifiable, its stones cracked but stubbornly intact, marking where heat had once been controlled. Fire had not erased everything, it had selected. This selectivity was familiar to frontier survivors. Fire rarely destroyed evenly. It consumed according to airflow, material, and chance. Some items endured simply because they lay beyond reach. Others survived because they burned differently than expected. Samuel scanned the ruins without hurry, knowing haste distorted judgment. What survived mattered less than how it survived. Tools half buried in ash were assessed for integrity rather than appearance. Metal warped but usable held value. Wood that appeared solid but rang hollow when touched did not. Settlers learned to distrust surface impressions. Fire altered strength invisibly. Damage assessment on the frontier followed practical logic. First came safety, ensuring no hidden embers threatened renewed ignition. Next came salvage, identifying what could be carried, repaired, or repurposed. Emotion came later, if at all. This order was not heartless, it was efficient. Samuel moved carefully around the perimeter, observing before acting. Each step was deliberate. Snow around the cabin had melted unevenly, exposing ground that remained dangerously warm beneath the surface. Fire lingered in places that looked harmless. Frontier accounts warned of this repeatedly. Morning light did not mean danger had passed.
Emotional restraint played a central role in survival accounting. The cabin represented years of effort, but emotion could not be allowed to dictate priorities. Samuel acknowledged the loss without dwelling on it. Dwelling wasted time. Time now translated directly into exposure, hunger, and vulnerability. He categorized what remained into immediate and long-term considerations. Immediate needs included warmth, food access, and temporary shelter. Long-term concerns, rebuilding, supply replacement, structural planning, were secondary and conditional. The frontier punished those who planned too far ahead without securing the present. Some losses carried delayed consequences. Stored food damaged by smoke might appear edible but carry unseen contamination. Tools weakened by heat could fail under load weeks later. Fire's impact extended beyond the visible. Frontier survival demanded suspicion of anything that had passed through intense heat. The reality of rebuilding began to surface with clarity. Rebuilding was not simply reconstruction, it was relocation, redesign, and recommitment. A new cabin would require weeks of labor under reduced capacity. It would demand fuel, time, and weather cooperation. Many settlers rebuilt nearby out of necessity, even when the land itself had proven risky. Samuel understood that rebuilding was possible only because he had survived the initial crisis intact. The frontier made this distinction brutally clear. Structures could be replaced, bodies could not. That arithmetic governed every decision that followed. Morning also clarified scale. At night, fire had dominated perception, its glow magnifying threat and possibility. In daylight, the cabin's footprint looked smaller, the clearing larger. The wilderness reasserted itself, unchanged and indifferent. The cabin had been a temporary intrusion. The land remained. This realization carried both weight and relief. Loss felt real, but it was not personal. The frontier did not target individuals. It applied pressure uniformly, rewarding adaptation and punishing rigidity. Samuel had adapted. That mattered more than what he had lost.
He revisited his own condition next. Cold fatigue lingered, but movement and daylight offered recovery potential. Hands regained some dexterity. Breathing steadied. These signs mattered. Survivors learned to inventory themselves as carefully as supplies. Physical capability determined timelines. Morning light also forced decisions that night allowed him to postpone. Staying near the ruins offered access to materials but risked renewed fire danger. Moving away reduced risk but increased distance from salvageable resources. Frontier choices were rarely binary. They involved managing gradients of risk rather than avoiding danger entirely. Samuel weighed these factors without illusion. There would be no clean outcome, only workable ones. He selected a path that preserved flexibility, allowing reassessment as conditions evolved. Survival on the frontier favored those who kept options open. The ruins stood as evidence of failure, but also instruction. Fire had revealed weaknesses in design, placement, and assumption. These lessons were costly, but they were also specific. Frontier history was built on such moments, where loss translated into knowledge passed quietly forward. Rebuilding would not repeat the same form. It would incorporate distance, spacing, and redundancy learned the hard way. Fire demanded respect, not fear. Respect expressed itself through design, habit, and restraint. As the sun climbed higher, the last of the smoke thinned. What remained was silent, altered ground, and a man standing within it, alive and capable of choosing next steps. The cost of survival was visible now, measured in charred wood and altered plans.
Rebuilding was possible, but only with the lessons fire had forced into the open. Every frontier disaster carved a rule into memory. These rules were not written down or formally taught. They were absorbed through consequence, reinforced by loss, and remembered because forgetting them carried a cost few survived twice. Fire had enforced its rule with clarity, not through spectacle, but through sequence. One compromise led to another, each reasonable in isolation, until together they crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. This was how frontier knowledge evolved, not through theory, but through correction.
Survival doctrines on the frontier were rarely abstract. They were practical truths distilled from repeated outcomes. Fire demanded spacing. Heat required distance. Structures built too close to their fuel invited disaster. Redundancy mattered because single systems failed without warning. Ventilation was not a comfort feature, but a survival mechanism. These principles were not optional preferences. They were rules enforced by environment rather than authority. Spacing was the first lesson fire taught. Fire needed room to exist safely. Cabins that embraced fire too closely invited it to spread. Distance reduced transfer, slowed escalation, and created reaction time. Many settlers learned this only after losing a structure. Those who survived adjusted accordingly, placing hearths differently, storing fuel farther away, and building with intentional separation between critical elements. Redundancy followed naturally. Relying on a single heat source, a single shelter, or a single plan concentrated risk. Frontier survivors learned to build backups into their lives, even when resources were limited. Extra kindling stored away from the main supply, alternative shelter options identified before they were needed. Redundancy was not waste, it was insurance. Ventilation completed the doctrine. Airflow controlled fire behavior more reliably than force ever could. Proper draft removed smoke, regulated heat, and signaled imbalance early. When airflow failed, everything else followed. This lesson was subtle and often ignored until it was too late. Those who learned it treated airflow as a system to be monitored daily, not a feature to be assumed. Experience mattered more than strength because experience recognized patterns before they became emergencies. Strong men failed when they trusted force to overcome environment. Frontier survivors survived by avoiding situations where force was required at all. Fire could not be fought physically, it could only be anticipated and managed indirectly. Samuel's understanding evolved in this space between loss and clarity. The fire had not punished ignorance, it had punished assumption. He had known the rules in fragments, but he had not integrated them fully. The cabin had been built to endure cold, not to resist prolonged internal stress. Fire had exploited that distinction. This realization altered how he viewed control. Control was temporary. Conditions shifted constantly. Wind changed, materials aged, systems degraded. Survival depended on respect for these variables rather than confidence in fixed solutions. The frontier rewarded humility expressed through preparation.
This logic stood in sharp contrast to modern comfort assumptions. Modern systems often hid risk behind convenience. Fire burned out of sight, managed by infrastructure and distance. Redundancy existed invisibly. Ventilation adjusted automatically. These layers created the illusion that risk had been eliminated rather than deferred. On the frontier, nothing was deferred. Every risk remained present, visible, and personal. Fire was close because it had to be. Distance was a luxury many could not afford. That closeness forced a relationship built on attention rather than trust. Fire was not assumed safe. It was treated as conditionally useful. Fire itself was neutral. It neither intended harm nor offered protection. It responded to physics alone. It punished negligence and rewarded respect with equal indifference. Frontier settlers who survived understood this deeply. They did not fear fire, but they did not romanticize it either. Samuel now saw fire as a force that required constant negotiation. Not daily habits alone, but structural decisions informed by humility. Placement mattered, materials mattered, assumptions mattered most of all. Fire exposed weak assumptions without warning. The frontier rule Fire enforced was simple but unforgiving. Never allow a system to operate without margin. Margin created reaction time. Reaction time created options. Options created survival. Without margin, even small disruptions cascaded rapidly. This rule extended beyond fire. It applied to food storage, travel planning, and weather preparation. Fire simply enforced it more dramatically because its consequences were immediate and visible. The frontier taught through clarity rather than mercy. Samuel's experience placed him within a long, quiet lineage of settlers who adjusted after loss. These individuals rarely wrote accounts of their lessons. They passed them indirectly through altered behavior, changed designs, and cautious habits observed by others. Frontier knowledge moved through example rather than instruction. The burned cabin no longer represented failure alone. It represented correction. Fire had enforced its rule, and Samuel had survived long enough to absorb it. That survival placed responsibility on him to act differently moving forward. This understanding carried weight. It demanded restraint when confidence returned. It required discipline even when conditions seemed stable again. Frontier disasters often repeated themselves when survivors assumed the lesson had expired. Fire would remain part of survival. That would not change. What would change was how closely it was allowed to approach dependence. Respect created space. Space created safety. The frontier did not demand mastery. It demanded alignment. Those who attempted to control fire eventually lost. Those who respected it endured longer. Survival, Samuel understood now, depended not on control, but on respect.
Modern homes hide risk behind convenience. The frontier never did. In earlier times, danger was visible, present, and personal. Survival depended on recognizing it early and responding without delay. That clarity has faded, but the forces themselves have not changed. The lessons learned from frontier fire remain relevant because the fundamentals of risk have not disappeared. Fire still behaves according to the same principles. Heat still transfers, air still feeds flame, materials still weaken over time. What has changed is how far removed people have become from these processes. Convenience has layered distance between cause and consequence, creating the impression that risk has been solved rather than managed. Frontier fire lessons translate directly into modern life when stripped of nostalgia. Spacing matters, redundancy matters, ventilation matters. Systems fail when they operate without margin. These truths apply whether the structure is a log cabin or a modern home. The difference lies in awareness. On the frontier, failure announced itself quickly. Today, it often waits. The tension between redundancy and convenience defines much of modern safety thinking. Redundancy requires effort, cost, and attention. Convenience minimizes friction by assuming reliability. Frontier settlers could not afford that assumption. Their lives depended on preparing for failure rather than trusting systems to endure indefinitely. Samuel's experience stands not as a heroic tale, but as an archetype. He represents the countless individuals who faced loss, adjusted behavior, and moved forward without recognition. There was no audience for survival on the frontier. There was only outcome. Those who survived rarely described themselves as brave. They described themselves as attentive. Fire in this context was never a villain. It was a necessity. It provided warmth, light, and the ability to live where nature otherwise forbade it. Treating fire as an enemy distorted understanding. The frontier demanded a more honest relationship, one based on respect rather than fear. Fire gave life, and it reclaimed it without intention or malice. The final survival doctrine emerging from this story is simple but demanding. Never confuse stability with safety. Stability is temporary. Safety is active. It must be maintained through observation, adaptation, and restraint. Systems that work today may fail tomorrow under slightly altered conditions.
Returning to the defining day clarifies this truth. That morning began as countless others had. Routine created confidence. Confidence invited assumption. Assumption narrowed awareness. Fire exploited that narrowing not because of error alone, but because conditions aligned against complacency. The frontier did not punish people for using fire. It punished them for forgetting its nature. That distinction matters. Survival depended on memory, of past close calls, of inherited warnings, of lessons learned by others. Forgetting erased margin. Modern life benefits from inherited safety without always understanding its origins. Codes, standards, and systems exist because earlier generations faced consequences directly. The frontier represented an environment where those consequences arrived unfiltered. That clarity created knowledge worth preserving. Samuel's survival ensured the lesson endured. He would rebuild differently. He would place distance where there had been closeness. He would treat redundancy as necessity rather than excess. These adjustments were quiet, incremental, and effective. They did not eliminate risk, they reduced it. This is where the story reaches beyond its setting. It is not about cabins or fire alone. It is about how humans interact with systems they depend on. Whether those systems are mechanical, structural, or environmental, the principle remains. Respect maintains margin. Margin preserves options. The frontier never forgave mistakes because forgiveness implied delay. Consequences arrived on their own schedule, unaffected by intention or regret. Yet the frontier preserved lessons faithfully. Those who survived carried them forward, altering designs, habits, and assumptions. Fire continued to burn in new hearths, under new roofs, guided by old rules. The landscape changed slowly. The logic remained. This story matters because the forces involved have not softened. They wait unchanged for moments when attention slips. Remembering frontier lessons is not about romanticizing hardship. It is about recognizing that survival has always depended on awareness. The frontier never forgave mistakes, but it preserved the lesson. This story does not end with ash or loss, but with clarity. The frontier stripped survival down to its essentials and judged every assumption without mercy. What endured was not strength or confidence, but respect for forces that never changed. Fire remained, the land remained, and the lesson remained, waiting for the next moment when attention would matter more than comfort. If this story made you rethink what safe really means, pass it on to someone who still believes comfort replaces preparation. Stories like this survive only when they're carried forward by people who recognize their value. And before you move on, where in the world are you watching from, and what would you have done differently that morning?